Hi, my name is Pam Palmater. Welcome back to my channel where we focus on educating the resistance and inspiring the next generation of warriors to protect our people and the planet. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, sharing my videos, and liking the videos so that we can spread the word to all of our social justice allies all over the world. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some pretty shocking tweets from Conservative MP Maxime Bernier. He seems to be obsessed with what he calls extreme multiculturalism, or the cult of diversity. His main point is that diversity and infinite amounts of diversity, or diversity that's allowed to continue in Canada, is in fact destructive to what he calls Canadian culture and a sense of Canadian identity. He warns of what he calls cultural Balkanization that will only lead to social conflict and violence. Now, Balkanization generally is a geopolitical term which really references when different areas within a nation state become independent and are hostile with one another. And I don't think Canada's commitment to multiculturalism and sharing in the richness and diversity of people from all different cultures can anywhere be considered Balkanization or the creating of hostile communities. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. These series of tweets had a very different tone to them. Sometimes they almost read as frantic or desperate, but you really have to look at the background context of Maxime Bernier to understand where is that desperation coming from and what are all these tweets really about. Are Canadians really in danger of diversity? Or is it something else that's more particular to this politician? If you look at Maxime Bernier's history, you'll know, and he admits it readily, that he is a separatist from Quebec. He voted in the 1995 referendum in Quebec to separate from Canada. And we all know that that referendum failed, and so his efforts to separate from Canada too failed. But he went on from there to become elected as a Conservative MP, and he was even appointed as a minister in Harper's government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. However, he was forced to resign shortly thereafter amid a scandal because he left classified documents at his girlfriend's place for more than a month and really damaged Canada's reputation with its NATO allies about whether or not it could keep and protect classified information. Bernier's failures continue to add up even after that. He ran in the race to lead the Conservative Party and he lost to Andrew Scheer. But he didn't just take that defeat sitting down. He wrote a book, essentially a cry-all, about why he didn't win this leadership race, which his own fellow conservatives said was really just about sour grapes and fulfilling his own vanity and need for attention. Then, after the Harper Conservatives failed miserably in the last election and gave the Trudeau Liberals a majority, he was appointed in the Conservative official opposition in the shadow cabinet under the Conservatives. However, recently he was dismissed from that shadow cabinet appointment. So you have to look at Maxime Bernier in the context of his numerous failures as a politician and in his attempts at leadership. He hasn't been successful, and each time you'll see he reacts with sour grapes, he reacts with hatefulness. So we essentially have this series of events that have led up to what I would call extreme sour grapes. You have a person who's failed in all of his political undertakings, and now he's not in a position of influence at all. So what does he do? He decides to ride that populist wave of white supremacy that seems to be infecting the United States and making its way up to Canada through Ontario. In the United States, you have Donald Trump, who was elected despite his very sexist remarks, racist remarks, anti-immigration remarks, his fear-mongering, and even his anti-democratic stance against an open and free media. That wave is starting to make its way up into Canada through Ontario. Most recently, Premier Doug Ford was elected. He's been described by US and Canadian commentators as a right-wing populist. He had almost no platform compared to the other members except let's protect our own, we're going to cut social programs, and buck a beer for everybody. If that's not a sign of concern, I don't know what is. But here you see another example of a politician here in Canada trying to gain notoriety, trying to gain back some semblance of attention and influence by riding this populist wave of white supremacy. But here's the thing, although Bernier is trying to blame immigrants for social conflict and violence and the destruction of Canadian identity, what he's really crying about are his own failures. And ironically, his own failures come from his own people and his own party. Normally, I tend to ignore racist trolls online. Trolls in the sense of people who just spew hatred and racism and misogynistic comments, which differ, of course, from people who offer valid political, legal, or social criticisms or debate. However, Maxime Bernier has been in and out of positions of influence, and it's important that we push back on these kinds of white supremacist attitudes because of the potential it has to infect our communities. So as commentators, we can say, well, he's uneducated, he's uninformed, he doesn't represent the majority of Canadians, let's just ignore him. However, his comments do trickle down through social media, and the last thing we want are these hateful and divisive comments becoming an ideology in our communities and start creating divisions or manufacturing problems where problems didn't previously exist. We know as a country that we have a problem with racism and sexism. We know we have these problems, and these are things that we have to deal with. What we don't need are people like Maxime Bernier fueling the fire of hatred and really countering the efforts that we're making at trying to educate Canadians and bring people together. This week, Bernier also targeted his hatred towards Indigenous peoples when the federal government announced that it would be coming up with some kind of statutory holiday or day of remembrance for Indigenous peoples who suffered in residential schools. He took to Twitter again to criticize the idea. In fact, Bernier tweeted that a day of remembrance would be feeding what he called a cult of victimhood and was another, quote, sick example of political correctness. And he couldn't be further from the truth. And I wonder, in fact, if he has those same opinions of Remembrance Day and remembering the atrocities that happened in war or honoring the lives of those that were lost. I wonder if he has those same attitudes about all of the war memorials all over this country. Somehow I suspect he doesn't. The whole point of days of remembrance and memorials is about remembering the atrocities that were committed in this country. It's also about honoring the lives that were lost. But equally important is about making sure that it never happens again. The worst thing that could happen in this country is for people to forget what Canada did in residential school. And this is something that countries do all over the world. Take, for example, Germany. It has taken great effort to erase all the symbols of Nazism, and also at the same time create memorials to honor all of those lives that were lost, in the hopes that as a country they will never ever let that happen again. Countries all over the world engage in this kind of remembrance and memorialization, and Canada should be no different. And that's what reconciliation is all about. It's not about all the touchy feel-good celebrations. Reconciliation, if it's done right, is going to be painful. It's going to make people feel uncomfortable. It might even make people like Maxime Bernier feel angry. And reconciliation does mean changing the history books. It does mean changing the symbols that represent Canada. And it does mean days of remembrance that don't just focus on Canadians, but also focus on the history of Indigenous peoples. It's a bit ironic that Bernier, on the one hand, wants to erase Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultures and history, while at the same time keeping out other peoples, new immigrants from diverse cultures, because he has this unfounded fear that diversity is somehow going to take away from Canadian culture. But that's only if you define Canadian culture as whiteness. If you define Canadian culture as all of the people that live on this territories and all of the cultures and all of the traditions, languages, and practices, which started with Indigenous nations, then it's something to celebrate, it's something to embrace, it's something that makes us unique. It's nothing to be feared. But in fairness, Bernier is not the only one to have espoused any of these racist or supremacist views. Take, for example, former Conservative Senator Lynn Bayek. She made lots of racist comments about Indigenous peoples. Thankfully, the Conservative senators kicked her out of caucus, but she's still there as a senator, and that's a problem. Look at Conservative MP Pierre Poilievre. On the very day of the residential school apology made in Parliament by his own Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, he goes on the radio and makes racist comments about Native people. He apologized afterwards, but the damage is already done. He should have been removed as well. So Bernier wasn't the only one. So the question then is, what is Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer going to do about this? So far, he hasn't taken a whole lot of steps to distance himself from Bernier's comments, nor has he taken moves to actually boot him out of caucus, which is in fact what he should do. Political leaders like Andrew Scheer have a decision to make. What do you and your party stand for? Because this is not the place to be ambiguous or sit on the fence. You either stand with Maxime Bernier's hateful white supremacy, or you stand far away from it. There is no middle ground, and it looks right now like Andrew Scheer is standing more with Bernier than against him. And if Andrew Scheer took this issue seriously, he would boot Bernier and tell Canadians unequivocally, we are not a racist party, we are not a white supremacist party, and we won't stand for it from anyone within our ranks. The next move is his, I guess.